My sister rolled her eyes at me during dinner and told her new boyfriend, "Ignore him. He's just the family loser." Everyone at the table laughed while she sipped her wine like it was a joke. They didn't know I owned the company her boyfriend was desperately trying to buy. And 2 months later, I ruined their wedding in front of everyone. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I always felt like I was the extra chair at the dinner table that nobody actually needed but kept around for appearance. My family cared deeply about how things looked from the outside. My mother treated our home like it was a stage set for a lifestyle magazine. Every dinner had to look perfect, every holiday had to be photographed, and every moment that could be turned into a smiling social media post was carefully arranged. She had this way of walking through the house before guests arrived, adjusting decorations, and reminding everyone how we were supposed to behave. My father was different, but somehow even more rigid. He believed success came from choosing the right career, making the right connections, and maintaining a reputation that people respected. In his mind, life followed a very specific script, and if you didn't follow it, then you were wasting your potential. My older sister Vanessa fit perfectly into that script. From the time we were kids, she seemed to glow in every room she entered. She loved attention, and people loved giving it to her. She entered beauty pageants, built a massive social media following before most people even understood what that meant, and somehow managed to turn every school event into a moment where she was the center of attention. My parents adored it. They talked about her like she was proof that they had done everything right as parents. Every trophy she won was displayed proudly in the living room. Every photo of her smiling at some event ended up framed or posted online with captions about how proud they were. Next to Vanessa, I felt like a shadow. I wasn't loud, I wasn't charming, and I definitely wasn't interested in performing for anyone's approval. I preferred sitting in my room with my computer, trying to understand how things worked. Coding fascinated me in a way that was hard to explain to people who didn't care about technology. I loved the quiet logic of it, the idea that with enough patience you could build something from nothing but lines of code. While my parents talked about networking events, law school, and careers that sounded impressive at dinner parties, I was teaching myself programming languages and spending nights experimenting with software projects that no one else even knew existed. To my parents, that just looked like isolation and wasted time. My father would occasionally stand in my doorway, watching the glow of my monitor light up the room, and ask me what exactly I planned to do with my life. He said it in the same tone people use when they look at a puzzle that doesn't make sense. He believed I had potential, but also believed I hadn't figured out how to use it. My mother worried more about how I looked to other people. She would ask why I never joined Vanessa at events, or why I didn't try to be more social. Sometimes she suggested I dress differently, or would talk more confidently when guests came over. It always felt like they were trying to polish something that they assumed was broken. Vanessa, on the other hand, never had to try to meet their expectations because she naturally fit them. She was the golden child in every way that mattered to them. When relatives visited, the conversations always drifted toward her accomplishments, her popularity, her future opportunities. I sat there listening while people talked about her like she was already destined for something extraordinary. When the attention occasionally shifted toward me, it was usually followed by comments about how quiet I was or how someday I might surprise everyone if I ever came out of my shell. What none of them realized was that the quiet time they worried about had been the most productive years of my life. While they assumed I was just hiding behind a computer screen, I had been building something piece by piece. It started as a small idea during my early 20s when I became fascinated with financial data and how inefficient most analytics tools were. I began experimenting with ways to process large volumes of market information faster and more accurately. At first, it was just a personal challenge, something that kept my mind occupied late at night while the rest of the house slept. Over time, that project evolved into something much bigger. I called it Northbridge Systems. The name sounded corporate and distant enough that nobody in my personal life would ever connect it to me. I spent years refining the platform, writing thousands of lines of code, testing algorithms, and gradually turning it into a financial analytics system that could process market patterns in ways most traditional tools couldn't match. The strange part was that the more successful it became, the easier it was to keep it hidden from my family. Northbridge Systems slowly gained attention in certain corners of the tech and finance world. Small firms started licensing the software because it gave them faster insights into market behavior. Then larger firms started noticing. The platform expanded quietly, almost invisibly, just like I had always been in my own household. Contracts grew larger, revenue increased, and my name never appeared anywhere publicly connected to it because I had intentionally structured everything that way. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, I was still treated like the uncertain younger son who hadn't quite figured things out yet. My parents would ask polite questions about my work as a software developer, usually followed by subtle hints that maybe I should consider something more stable or prestigious. Vanessa would scroll through her phone at the table, occasionally mentioning brand partnerships or upcoming events while my parents listened with admiration. I never corrected their assumptions. In a strange way, their low expectations gave me the freedom to keep building my life without interference. They believed I was still searching for direction, while in reality, I had already created something far bigger than anything they had ever imagined for me. Northbridge Systems was growing quietly in the background, and every day it became more valuable, more influential, and more real. Inside the Carter family, I remained the invisible son. Outside of it, without anyone in my family realizing, I had already built an empire made entirely of code. After I graduated from university in Colorado with a scholarship in computer science, most people in my family expected that I would eventually settle into some ordinary entry-level programming job and slowly try to figure out what to do with my life. That assumption followed me everywhere whenever I came back home to Portland for holidays or family gatherings. The truth was that while I did take on freelance programming work after graduation, those jobs were never meant to be my long-term career. They were simply the financial cover that allowed me to continue developing the one project that had been occupying my mind for years. While other graduates were sending out resumes and trying to impress hiring managers, I spent most of my time refining the platform that had started as a late-night experiment during my early 20s. Northbridge Systems had already grown far beyond the small prototype I once worked on in my bedroom. The software had become a complex financial analytics platform capable of analyzing enormous volumes of market data in ways that most existing tools simply could not match. I spent years improving its algorithms, optimizing its speed, and quietly building the infrastructure that allowed it to operate at a professional level. At the same time, I kept my public life intentionally simple. I worked remotely as a freelancer, accepted contracts that paid enough to cover my living expenses, and used every free hour to continue building the system that no one around me even knew existed. Eventually, the moment arrived when the platform stopped being just my private project and started attracting attention from people who actually understood the value of what I had created. It began with a small investment firm that somehow discovered a limited version of my analytics tool through a developer forum where I had posted some technical concepts without revealing the full platform behind them. They reached out to me with questions, curious about the algorithms I had designed. At first, I assumed the conversation would end after a few emails, but instead it evolved into a demonstration, then a trial license, and finally a contract. That single agreement brought in more money than any freelance job I had ever taken. Once one firm started using Northbridge Systems, others began hearing about it through the quiet professional networks that exist inside the finance world. Hedge funds, private investment groups, and trading firms are always looking for any advantage they can find, and my platform offered them faster analysis and deeper insights into market behavior. Within a couple of years, I had licensed the software to multiple clients. Each contract increased the platform's reputation and its value. The revenue from those deals quickly grew into numbers that would have shocked anyone who still thought I was just another freelance programmer trying to get by. Despite the success, I made a very deliberate decision to keep my life looking ordinary from the outside. I avoided public attention and structured my business so that my name rarely appeared anywhere connected to the platform. I purchased a modest house instead of something extravagant, chose a quiet neighborhood, and continued working from home exactly the same way I always had. My daily routine barely changed. I spent most of my time in front of my computer refining the system, communicating with clients through encrypted channels, and expanding the infrastructure that supported the platform's growing demand. Whenever I visited my family, nothing about their perception of me had changed. To them, I was still the quiet younger son who had never quite stepped into a real career. My mother continued offering gentle but condescending encouragement that sounded more like concern disguised as advice. She would look at me across the dinner table with a sympathetic expression and say things like, "You're still young, Logan. You'll find your real career someday." She said it as if my life was some unfinished project that needed direction. My father usually nodded in agreement, occasionally mentioning people he knew who worked in respectable industries and suggesting that I might want to consider something similar. Vanessa treated the whole situation with a different kind of amusement. By the time we were both adults, she had built an entire online identity around fashion, lifestyle content, and a constant performance of success that social media rewards. Whenever she talked about her work, it sounded glamorous and busy, full of collaborations, events, and followers. Compared to that world, my quiet remote lifestyle seemed dull and unimpressive. She liked to tease me about it during family gatherings, calling my routine a nerdy laptop life, while laughing as if the phrase itself was the punchline to a joke. None of them had any idea that the laptop she was mocking had become the center of a business that generated millions through licensing deals and private investments. The money from Northbridge Systems accumulated quietly in accounts and investment portfolios that I rarely talked about. I didn't feel any need to prove anything to them or correct their assumptions. After years of growing up as the overlooked sibling in a family that celebrated appearances, I had become comfortable with silence. There was something strangely peaceful about letting them believe their version of my life, while the reality remained completely different. They saw a quiet programmer who worked from home and hadn't yet achieved anything impressive in their eyes. Meanwhile, the platform I had built continued expanding in industries they barely understood. Every new contract strengthened the system. Every new client added credibility, and every month the company became more valuable. By the time I was 29, Northbridge Systems had grown into something far beyond what I originally imagined during those late nights of coding. Yet when I sat at the Carter family dinner table, listening to Vanessa describe her latest photo shoot or my parents discuss social events and career expectations, I remained exactly who they believed I was. The invisible son with a laptop, quietly listening, quietly existing, and never bothering to explain that the quiet life they pitted had already made me far more successful than they would ever guess. Everything in my family's carefully constructed world shifted the moment Vanessa introduced us to her new boyfriend. His name was Ethan Blake, and from the very first moment I heard the way she said his name during a phone call with my mother, I could already tell she was excited in the way she only became excited when something fit perfectly into the image she liked to present to the world. She described him as a finance executive from Chicago, someone deeply involved in major investment deals and corporate strategy, the kind of career that sounded impressive even to people who barely understood what it actually involved. By the time she finally brought him to Portland to meet the family, my parents were already convinced that Vanessa had found exactly the kind of partner they had always hoped she would end up with. The evening he first walked into my parents' house felt less like meeting a new person and more like watching a carefully staged introduction to a character who had already been approved by everyone except me. Ethan was in his mid-30s, tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that immediately filled the room. He shook my father's hand with a firm grip, smiled warmly at my mother, and greeted everyone as if he had been part of the family for years. His voice had that smooth tone people often develop when they're used to speaking in meetings or presentations where confidence matters more than accuracy. Within the first 10 minutes, he had already mentioned investment strategies, corporate negotiations, and several vague references to major players in the financial world who apparently knew him well. My mother was instantly fascinated. I could practically see the satisfaction in her expression as she watched Vanessa standing next to a man who fit perfectly into the image of success she loved presenting to friends and neighbors. She asked him endless questions about his work in Chicago, about the companies he dealt with, about the scale of the financial projects he was supposedly involved in. Ethan answered every question smoothly, using impressive-sounding phrases about portfolio management, market positioning, and high-level negotiations. To someone who didn't spend much time around the finance industry, everything he said sounded sophisticated and convincing. My father was equally impressed, though in a slightly different way. He admired careers that carried authority and status, and Ethan spoke like someone who had both. During dinner, they quickly moved into conversations about economic trends and investment opportunities, topics my father rarely discussed with anyone else in the family, because Vanessa had no interest in them and my mother preferred lighter subjects. Ethan spoke confidently about market movements and large financial deals, as if he personally navigated them every day. My father listened with the kind of respectful attention he usually reserved for people he considered successful professionals. Vanessa looked proud the entire evening, occasionally glancing around the room, as if silently confirming that everyone noticed what she had managed to bring into the family. She leaned into Ethan when he spoke, laughed at his stories, and added little comments about how busy his work kept him and how demanding his schedule could be because of the scale of his responsibilities. To her, Ethan represented exactly the type of partner that enhanced her image. He was confident, impressive, and seemed connected to a world of wealth and influence. While everyone else seemed captivated by him, I sat quietly at the table listening to the conversation unfold, and from the beginning something about Ethan felt slightly wrong to me. It was not anything obvious or dramatic, just a subtle collection of small details that did not align the way they should have. I had spent years working indirectly with people in finance because of Northbridge systems, communicating with analysts, traders, and executives who relied on my platform to interpret complex market data. Real finance professionals tended to speak with a certain precision when discussing their work. Even when they simplified explanations for outsiders, there was usually a clear structure behind what they were saying. Ethan, on the other hand, spoke in a way that sounded impressive on the surface, but strangely vague once you actually listened carefully. He used a lot of flashy business terminology, the kind that appears frequently in motivational business articles and networking events. Words like leverage, synergy, and strategic positioning appeared often in his sentences, but they rarely connected to specific details. Whenever my father asked something more concrete about his role or the companies he worked with, Ethan responded by widening the scope of the conversation instead of narrowing it. He also seemed to enjoy mentioning his connections. Throughout the evening, he casually referred to people he knew in investment circles, high-profile investors he had supposedly collaborated with, and private deals he had been involved in. The way he described those connections felt more like storytelling than professional discussion. Each example sounded impressive but strangely rehearsed, almost as if he had practiced explaining them in a way that maximized admiration. I noticed other small things as well. His confidence was constant and perfectly controlled, which might sound like a positive trait, but in reality, most experienced professionals occasionally pause or think before answering complicated questions. Ethan never did. Every response came quickly and smoothly, delivered with the certainty of someone who knew he was being watched and admired. It felt less like a conversation and more like a performance designed to maintain a very specific impression. Of course, none of this bothered anyone else at the table. My mother was practically glowing with satisfaction, already imagining how impressive it would sound when she told friends that Vanessa was dating a powerful finance executive from Chicago. My father clearly respected Ethan and seemed relieved that Vanessa had found someone whose career matched the kind of success he valued. Vanessa herself looked completely happy with the attention Ethan attracted simply by being present. I remained mostly silent during dinner, which no one found unusual, because silence had always been my role in family conversations. From the outside, I probably looked like the same quiet, slightly awkward younger brother who preferred observing rather than participating. In reality, I was paying close attention to every word Ethan said, every detail of the stories he told, and every small inconsistency hidden beneath the confident surface he presented. The longer I listened, the stronger the uneasy feeling in the back of my mind became. Ethan Blake carried himself like a man who was used to being admired, but something about the way he spoke about finance felt strangely artificial to me. His confidence looked polished and convincing to my family, yet from where I sat it seemed less like genuine expertise and more like a well-rehearsed act. A few weeks after Ethan first appeared in our lives, my mother decided that the situation deserved what she called a proper family dinner. In her mind, the first meeting had apparently gone so well that now it was time to make things official. The kind of evening where everyone dressed nicely, the table was arranged with her best dishes, and the entire atmosphere was designed to look like a polished, successful family gathering. She called me personally a few days before the dinner and insisted that I come. Her tone carried that familiar mixture of expectation and quiet pressure that she had used my entire life whenever something needed to look perfect in front of other people. When I arrived at my parents' house that Sunday evening, everything looked exactly the way I expected. The dining room lights were warm and carefully positioned. The table was decorated with candles and neatly folded napkins, and the smell of a large homemade meal filled the house. My mother greeted me with a quick hug before immediately adjusting something on the table, as if even a slight imperfection might ruin the presentation. My father stood near the kitchen, speaking casually with Ethan, who was already there and seemed completely comfortable in the house, as though he had been part of the family for years rather than a few weeks. Vanessa sat next to him, leaning slightly toward him as she laughed at something he had just said. The moment I walked in, Ethan turned toward me with a confident smile that looked friendly on the surface, but carried something else underneath it, something I couldn't quite define at first, but recognized as soon as he started speaking. Dinner began normally enough. Everyone sat down, plates were filled, and the conversation started with the usual topics my family liked discussing. My mother talked about neighborhood news and upcoming social events. Vanessa mentioned something about a brand collaboration she was working on, and my father asked Ethan about the financial world in Chicago. Ethan spoke easily, exactly as he had during our previous meeting, describing deals and market trends with the same confident tone that had impressed my parents so quickly. At first, I remained quiet, focusing on my food and listening to the conversation the same way I always did during family dinners. That silence had long ago become my default position in the Carter household, and nobody expected anything different from me. But eventually the conversation drifted toward careers and work, which was usually the moment when things became slightly uncomfortable for me. Ethan glanced in my direction with a curious expression that looked almost playful. He asked what I was working on these days, and before I could answer fully, Vanessa jumped in with a small laugh and explained that I worked remotely on computers and programming projects. She said it in a tone that made it sound less like a career and more like an odd hobby that I hadn't grown out of yet. Ethan nodded slowly and leaned back in his chair as if considering the information carefully. Then he smiled and made a casual remark about how he had met plenty of tech guys over the years who thought they were going to become entrepreneurs, but usually ended up teaching coding classes to teenagers at local community centers. The way he said it was wrapped in humor, the kind of comment that people deliver while laughing, so it appears harmless even though the message behind it is clearly dismissive. Vanessa laughed immediately, a loud, enthusiastic laugh that filled the room and signaled to everyone else that the joke was worth enjoying. My mother smiled politely, and my father chuckled in that restrained way people do when they think a comment is slightly rude but still amusing enough not to challenge. I didn't respond. I simply kept eating and let the moment pass, which only seemed to encourage Ethan. He continued talking about how unpredictable the tech world could be and how many programmers believed they were building the next big platform, when in reality, most of them struggled to turn their ideas into real businesses. He described it like an amusing pattern he had observed throughout his career in finance, the kind of observation that made him sound knowledgeable while quietly belittling the people he was talking about. Vanessa kept laughing, occasionally adding small comments that pushed the teasing further. She mentioned my habit of spending long hours in front of a laptop and joked that I probably spoke more lines of code than actual sentences some days. The table reacted with light laughter, and the conversation began orbiting around me in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. At one point, Ethan leaned forward slightly and looked directly at me with that same confident smile. He asked if I had ever thought about getting a real job instead of working quietly behind a computer screen all the time. The question was delivered with the same playful tone as his earlier comments, but the meaning was clear enough that the entire table immediately reacted. Vanessa laughed again, louder this time, while my father shook his head slightly, as if the question was blunt but understandable. My mother looked at me briefly and told me not to take things so seriously, reminding me to relax and not make the dinner awkward. That sentence landed with a quiet weight because it meant exactly what it always meant in our family. It meant that whatever discomfort I felt was less important than maintaining the smooth, pleasant atmosphere my parents valued so much. The laughter faded after a moment, but the message remained sitting there in the center of the table. Ethan had positioned himself as the successful professional teasing the quiet underachiever, and everyone else had accepted that narrative without hesitation. I stayed silent, partly because responding would only prolong the situation, and partly because I had spent years learning that defending myself during family moments like this rarely changed anything. What none of them realized, while the conversation drifted toward other topics and the dinner continued, was that Ethan's world and mine had already crossed paths before this evening in a way none of them could possibly imagine. Not long before that dinner, a company associated with Ethan had attempted to negotiate a financial technology deal involving Northbridge Systems. The platform they were interested in acquiring or licensing was the same system I had spent years building in complete secrecy. So while Ethan sat across from me, making jokes about programmers who never achieved anything meaningful, he had absolutely no idea that the quiet person he was mocking at the dinner table was the owner of the very platform his professional circle had been trying to secure access to. By the time dessert was placed on the table, the atmosphere had relaxed again into the comfortable rhythm my family preferred during gatherings. My mother had prepared one of her carefully arranged desserts, the kind that looked almost too polished to eat, and everyone shifted their attention toward lighter conversation. Vanessa sat close to Ethan with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the evening had gone exactly the way she wanted. My father poured another round of drinks, while my mother continued asking Ethan questions about his work, clearly enjoying the presence of someone she believed represented the kind of success she admired. Ethan, already comfortable in the center of attention, seemed more than happy to continue talking. As the conversation drifted back toward business and finance, he leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he was impressing everyone around him. He began describing an upcoming acquisition his company was planning, explaining that they were currently preparing to purchase a small but highly promising technology firm that had developed a predictive analytics platform for financial markets. He spoke about it as if it were one of the most exciting deals his company had pursued that year. The moment he mentioned the name of the company, something inside my mind immediately locked into place. I recognized it instantly because it was not just some small technology firm. It was the corporate name used for the holding structure behind Northbridge Systems. The platform I had spent years quietly building was now sitting at the center of the story Ethan was enthusiastically telling at my parents' dinner table. He continued speaking with growing enthusiasm, describing the platform as a rare opportunity in the financial technology space. He explained that its algorithms allowed firms to analyze market behavior with unusual speed and depth, which is why his company had been working aggressively to secure the acquisition. He spoke about it as if he had inside knowledge of every detail of the negotiation process. For the first time that evening, I decided to engage in the conversation. I calmly asked him a few questions about the deal, keeping my voice neutral and curious. I asked about the structure of the acquisition and how far along the negotiations had progressed. Ethan responded confidently, clearly pleased that someone at the table was finally showing interest in the subject he considered his domain of expertise. He explained that the deal was still in negotiation, but moving quickly. According to him, the executives at his firm believed the platform would become an essential tool for large investment groups once they integrated it into their existing systems. Then he added something that made the rest of the table visibly impressed. With a confident smile, He explained that he was personally leading the negotiations and managing the technical strategy behind the acquisition. Vanessa looked at him with admiration when he said that. My father nodded with clear approval, and my mother smiled as if the entire story confirmed everything she believed about Ethan's success. To them, it sounded like a major professional achievement. I listened quietly while he finished describing his role in the process. Once he was done speaking, I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my phone. The movement itself seemed small, but it was enough to shift the attention of everyone at the table toward me. I unlocked the screen and opened an email thread that had been active for months, a conversation between myself and several senior executives from the company Ethan had just mentioned. The chain included documents, negotiation details, and confirmation messages regarding the future of Northbridge Systems. Then I looked up at Ethan and calmly explained something none of them were expecting to hear. I told him that the company he was describing, the predictive analytics platform his firm was trying to acquire, was actually founded and owned by me. I explained that I was the developer and founder behind Northbridge Systems and that I had personally been negotiating with several firms regarding its future. I kept my voice steady and matter-of-fact as I spoke, almost the same way I would during a professional meeting. At first, no one reacted because the statement seemed too unexpected to process immediately. Vanessa blinked in confusion while my mother looked from me to Ethan as if she had misheard something. My father's expression shifted slowly from polite curiosity to quiet disbelief. I continued speaking calmly, explaining that during the past months, I had been in direct contact with executives from Ethan's company as part of the acquisition discussions he had just mentioned. I described several details from those negotiations that only someone involved in them could know. Then I added one final detail that made the silence in the room even heavier. Throughout all of those negotiations, during every conference call, document exchange, and meeting with their executive team, Ethan's name had never appeared once. Not as a representative, not as a strategist, and certainly not as someone leading the discussions. The room became completely silent. The only sound for several seconds was the faint clink of a spoon touching a plate somewhere on the table. Ethan's confident posture stiffened slightly as he tried to process what I had just said. Vanessa looked between the two of us with visible confusion while my parents sat motionless, clearly unsure how to react to what was unfolding in front of them. I glanced down at my phone again and opened another message, this one confirming a finalized agreement that had been completed only days earlier. Then I calmly explained the final piece of information. The negotiations with Ethan's company had ended because I had already signed a deal to sell Northbridge Systems to a completely different firm. The agreement had been finalized quietly, and the acquisition Ethan had been describing with such confidence was no longer even possible. His company had lost the opportunity. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening. The same table that had been full of laughter just minutes earlier now sat completely still as everyone slowly realized what the quiet person they had been mocking all night had just revealed. The silence that settled over the table after my explanation felt almost unreal, as if the room itself had suddenly lost its sense of direction. Only minutes earlier the dinner had been full of laughter and casual conversation, but now every person sitting there seemed frozen in place. My mother stared at me as though she was trying to understand whether what I had said was serious or some strange misunderstanding. My father's expression carried a mixture of disbelief and quiet calculation, the look of someone mentally reviewing every assumption he had made about me for years and realizing that those assumptions no longer made sense. Vanessa looked confused, her eyes moving between me and Ethan as if she expected one of us to explain what had just happened in a way that restored the comfortable version of reality she preferred. Ethan's reaction was the most telling. The confident posture he had maintained all evening had faded into a stiff, controlled stillness. The certainty that had colored his voice earlier was gone, replaced by the quiet tension of someone who had just realized that the story he had been telling in front of an entire table of people had completely collapsed. I could see him trying to think of something to say, something that would recover even a small portion of the authority he had claimed only moments earlier. Nothing came. I didn't feel the need to say anything more. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. I simply placed my phone back into my pocket, pushed my chair back from the table, and stood up. No one tried to stop me. The room was still wrapped in that stunned silence as I walked toward the door of the house where I had grown up. For years, I had sat quietly at that same table, listening to jokes about my supposed lack of direction in life, absorbing the subtle disappointment in my parents' voices and the casual mockery from my sister. That evening was the first time the entire dynamic had shifted in a way none of them were prepared for. I left the house without raising my voice, without arguing, and without waiting for a reaction. The night air outside felt strangely calm compared to the tension I had just left behind in the dining room. Over the following days, something unusual happened. No one from my family contacted me. There were no messages, no phone calls, and no attempts to discuss what had taken place. The silence continued as if everyone involved needed time to reorganize their understanding of who I actually was. For most of my life, they had viewed me as the quiet son who spent too much time behind a laptop without accomplishing anything impressive. Accepting that I had quietly built a technology platform valuable enough to attract major financial acquisitions was not something they could process overnight. During that time, I focused on finishing the final details of the agreement I had mentioned at the dinner. The acquisition of Northbridge Systems had already been arranged before that evening, but the final legal and financial confirmations still needed to be completed. The process moved forward quickly once the documents were signed. The platform I had built through years of quiet work officially became part of a much larger organization, and the financial result of that sale was larger than anything my family had ever imagined. The amount transferred to my accounts was enough to guarantee complete financial freedom for the rest of my life. It was the kind of outcome that many entrepreneurs spend decades chasing and often never achieve. When the final confirmation arrived, I sat alone in my home office looking at the numbers on the screen, aware that the long chapter of building Northbridge Systems had officially ended. A few days later, Vanessa finally contacted me. The message came privately rather than through the family group chats we occasionally used. Her tone was very different from the confident teasing she had displayed during the dinner. She admitted that she had never known anything about the platform or the business behind it. According to her, Ethan had been extremely angry after that evening because the situation had made him look incompetent at work. The failed acquisition had apparently been discussed within his professional circle, and my revelation at the dinner had left him exposed in a way he could not easily explain. I read the message without feeling any real satisfaction about that part of the situation. What happened to Ethan after the dinner wasn't something I had planned or even thought much about afterward. My decision to speak that night had simply been a response to years of quiet dismissal combined with the strange irony of hearing someone brag about negotiating a deal for a company they had never actually been involved with. Once the acquisition of Northbridge Systems was finalized, I made another decision that surprised even me. Instead of celebrating or immediately starting a new project, I stepped away from work entirely for a while. I arranged for everything that needed to be handled financially and legally, then packed a small bag and left Portland for a period of travel. I didn't announce it to anyone. I simply went. Traveling alone gave me the kind of quiet space I had rarely allowed myself while building the company. Without constant work schedules or negotiations occupying my attention, I finally had time to think clearly about everything that had happened over the years. I thought about the long nights of coding when no one believed anything important was coming from that effort. I thought about the family dinners where my future had been discussed like an unfinished problem that needed solving. I thought about the strange moment when all of those assumptions collapsed in a single conversation at a dinner table. Somewhere during that time away, a realization settled in my mind with unusual clarity. For most of my life, I had carried a quiet hope that eventually my family would recognize what I was capable of and see me differently. The success of Northbridge Systems had proven something important, but not in the way I originally expected. It showed me that the approval I had unconsciously been waiting for was never actually necessary. The years they had spent underestimating me no longer carried the same weight. My life, my work, and my future had grown independently of their expectations. By the time I returned from those travels, I understood something simple but powerful. I no longer needed validation from people who had spent so long misunderstanding who I was. About 2 months after that dinner, when the entire situation with my family had settled into a distant silence, I received an envelope in the mail with my parents' return address printed neatly in the corner. I already had a feeling about what it might contain before I even opened it. My family had always believed that time alone could smooth over uncomfortable moments, especially if those moments threatened the image they preferred to present to the world. When I unfolded the card inside, my suspicion was confirmed. It was a wedding invitation. Vanessa and Ethan were getting married. The invitation itself was elaborate, printed on thick decorative paper with elegant lettering that looked carefully selected to convey sophistication and success. The design looked exactly like something my mother would approve of, polished and formal enough to make the event appear important to anyone who received it. Along with the invitation, there was a short handwritten note from my mother. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, the way it always was when she wanted to sound sincere without actually addressing the uncomfortable details directly. The message was brief. She wrote that family was everything and that it would be a shame to let one awkward dinner ruin things between us. She added that Vanessa would be happy if I attended the ceremony and that it would mean a lot to everyone if we could move forward together. I sat at my kitchen table reading that note more than once. The wording told me exactly what I needed to know about how my parents were interpreting the situation. To them, the dinner where everything had fallen apart was simply an awkward moment that had gotten out of hand. In their minds, the easiest solution was to quietly move past it without discussing the deeper reasons why it had happened. The wedding invitation wasn't really about reconnecting with me or understanding what had changed. It was about restoring the appearance of a normal, supportive family at a public event where many people would be watching. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that my presence at the wedding would serve a very specific purpose. Vanessa and Ethan were about to present themselves to friends, relatives, and business contacts as a successful couple beginning a new chapter of their lives. Having the entire Carter family present would reinforce that image. An absent brother might raise questions, and questions were the one thing my family had always tried to avoid. At the same time, another thought kept returning to my mind whenever I remembered the dinner conversation with Ethan. The uneasy feeling I had experienced that night had never completely disappeared. His stories about finance, his exaggerated confidence, and the strange way he described his professional role had all left a lingering sense that something about him did not fully align with reality. Instead of responding to the invitation immediately, I decided to spend some time quietly looking into Ethan Blake's background. I had the resources to do it properly, and more importantly, I had connections with people who specialize in exactly that kind of investigation. Over the years, while building Northbridge systems, I had collaborated with cybersecurity professionals, analysts, and developers who understood how to uncover information hidden behind layers of corporate structure and online identities. One of those contacts eventually connected me with an old friend named Rachel, someone I had known years earlier through a technology conference. Rachel had built a career working in cybersecurity research and digital investigations, and she had a reputation for being extremely thorough when it came to tracing online financial activity. When I explained that I wanted to understand more about a man connected to my sister, she agreed to help me review whatever information was available. The investigation began quietly. We started with publicly accessible records, professional profiles, and business registrations associated with Ethan's name. At first, the results seemed ordinary enough, but as Rachel continued digging through corporate filings and digital traces, the picture began to look very different from the confident story Ethan had presented at my parents' dinner table. The first inconsistency appeared when we looked closely at his supposed executive role in the finance industry. According to Ethan's own description, he was involved in high-level negotiations and strategic financial deals. However, the employment records connected to his name told a far less impressive story. He was not a senior executive or strategic negotiator at all. His position within the company was in sales, specifically a role focused on client acquisition and business outreach. It was not an insignificant job, but it was nowhere near the level of authority he had claimed in front of my family. As Rachel continued searching through financial activity connected to Ethan's name, another discovery appeared that was far more concerning than simple exaggeration about a job title. Hidden behind a small shell company registered under a different business structure, there was evidence of a private cryptocurrency investment operation. The company had been quietly promoting investment opportunities to individuals through online channels, promising unusually high returns from crypto trading strategies that were described as proprietary and exclusive. The language used in those investment offers immediately raised red flags. The profits being promised were far beyond what legitimate financial operations could realistically guarantee, and the structure of the company appeared intentionally designed to obscure who was actually managing the funds. Rachel traced several digital signatures, transaction paths, and domain registrations connected to the operation, and many of those traces led back to Ethan. The deeper we looked, the clearer the pattern became. Ethan had been presenting himself publicly as a powerful finance professional while privately operating a questionable investment scheme that relied on attracting people who believed they were gaining access to exclusive opportunities. The combination of exaggerated credentials and hidden financial activity painted a picture that was far more troubling than the confident image he had shown my family. When Rachel finished compiling the information, I sat quietly reviewing the documents and digital evidence she had gathered. The wedding invitation still sat on my table, its elegant design now feeling strangely disconnected from the reality hidden behind Ethan's polished appearance. The more I learned about him, the more certain I became that the uneasy instinct I had felt during that dinner had not been misplaced. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, I had already made my decision about whether I would attend. The invitation from my parents had been sitting on my kitchen table for weeks, and during that time the investigation Rachel and I conducted had revealed more than enough information to completely change how I viewed the entire situation. By the time the ceremony approached, I was no longer attending simply as Vanessa's brother trying to repair a strained family relationship. I was attending because I understood exactly who Ethan Blake really was. Rachel agreed to come with me as my guest. She understood the situation better than anyone else because she had helped uncover the digital evidence that exposed the truth behind Ethan's carefully constructed professional image. When we arrived at the venue, the setting looked exactly the way I expected my mother would want it to look. The ceremony was held in an elegant event space just outside the city, decorated with white flowers, soft lighting, and carefully arranged seating that created the impression of a perfect celebration. Guests moved through the space dressed in formal clothing, greeting each other and complimenting the decorations while servers carried trays of drinks through the crowd. From the outside, everything looked flawless, the kind of wedding people photograph and post online to represent happiness, success, and a bright future. My parents moved through the reception, greeting relatives and friends with the proud smiles of hosts who believed the event reflected well on their family. Vanessa looked radiant in her wedding dress, smiling for photographs and accepting congratulations from guests who seemed genuinely happy for her. Ethan stood beside her in a tailored suit, shaking hands and speaking confidently with people as though he belonged naturally in the center of the celebration. Watching him move through the room with that familiar polished confidence felt strange after everything Rachel and I had uncovered. The same man who had exaggerated his role in finance and secretly operated a questionable crypto investment scheme now stood there accepting praise and admiration from dozens of people who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a successful marriage. The ceremony itself passed without incident. Vows were exchanged, applause followed, and the reception began soon afterward with music, drinks, and speeches from friends and family members. Several people spoke about Vanessa and Ethan as if their relationship represented the perfect partnership between ambition and charm. Each speech reinforced the same image that had been presented to everyone since Ethan first appeared in our lives. Rachel and I remained quiet at our table throughout most of the reception, observing the celebration as it continued. Eventually, the moment arrived when guests were invited to share toasts with a newly married couple. I stood up and walked calmly toward the front of the room where the microphone had been placed. The room gradually grew quieter as people noticed me stepping forward. Many of the guests probably assumed I was simply the bride's brother offering a supportive speech, something that would normally be expected at a wedding like this. My parents watched with polite anticipation, clearly hoping the evening would continue smoothly without any unexpected moments. I began exactly the way everyone expected. I congratulated Vanessa and Ethan and spoke about family, about growing up together, and about the hope that the two of them would build a strong life together. My voice remained calm and steady, and for the first part of the toast, the guests listened with relaxed smiles, as if everything was proceeding normally. Then the tone of my words slowly shifted. I explained that before celebrating a marriage built on trust, honesty should exist between everyone present in the room. I reached into my jacket and took out my phone along with several printed documents Rachel had helped prepare. A screen behind the reception stage had been set up earlier to display photographs and videos during the event, and with a simple connection, the first document appeared on that screen for everyone to see. The room fell silent almost instantly as people realized that the images being displayed were not wedding photographs. They were financial records, company registrations, and transaction histories connected to a shell corporation that had been quietly running an online cryptocurrency investment program. I calmly explained what those documents showed. The operation had promised investors unrealistic profits from crypto trading strategies that did not actually exist. Money had been collected from individuals who believed they were investing in a legitimate opportunity managed by someone with real expertise in finance. The evidence Rachel had connected that entire operation directly to Ethan. As more documents and recorded communications appeared on the screen, the reaction in the room shifted from confusion to shock. Guests began whispering to one another as they recognized the seriousness of what they were seeing. My parents stood frozen near the edge of the reception floor, their expressions changing rapidly from confusion to panic as they realized the situation unfolding in front of everyone they had invited. Vanessa looked at Ethan with a mixture of disbelief and fear that slowly replaced the excitement she had carried all day. The confident composure Ethan had displayed throughout the wedding disappeared as the evidence continued appearing on the screen behind me. I explained calmly that the investigation into the scheme had already been documented and sent to financial regulators and authorities responsible for investigating investment fraud. Every piece of information Rachel and I had gathered had been forwarded through the proper legal channels before the wedding even began. The reception hall had become completely silent, except for scattered whispers moving through the crowd. The celebration that had filled the room only minutes earlier had collapsed into stunned disbelief. Once I finished speaking, I placed the documents back into my jacket pocket and stepped away from the microphone. I did not raise my voice, and I did not wait for anyone to respond. I simply walked out of the reception hall with Rachel beside me, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed the truth behind the man my family had proudly welcomed. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded exactly as expected. Financial authorities began investigating the investment scheme connected to Ethan's shell company. The legal attention surrounding the case quickly destroyed the image he had spent years building. Vanessa's marriage to him did not survive the investigation, and the wedding that had been presented as a perfect beginning ended almost immediately in annulment. By the time everything settled, I found myself back in a quiet life I had chosen for myself, but with a different understanding of my place in my family's story. For years, I had been treated as the invisible son who stayed silent, while others decided what role I played in their version of reality. Walking away from that wedding reception marked the moment when that role finally ended.